Let's start with something a bit light, a joke, and a lesson to global warmers here now trying to exploit the terrible fires in Queensland. The joke is that we have another ship of fools, because here's the news from the Maritime Bulletin blog. An Arctic tour ship, MS Malmo, with 16 passengers on board, has got stuck in ice halfway between Norway and the North Pole. The ship was on an Arctic tour with a climate change documentary film team and tourists concerned with climate change and melting ice. Worry no longer about melting ice. Now, I can't find out who these global warming activists are. Sweden's Aftenposten paper hasn't identified them either. But I do love the image. Global warmists determined to scare us about how little Arctic ice there is, having to need rescue where they get trapped in exactly the ice they thought wasn't there. In fact, rescued by helicopters, which is terrible. I mean, think of all those emissions, those global warming emissions. But even funnier is that this has happened before, and more than once. 6 years ago, we were told of another ship of global warmers off to study polar ice, this time Antarctica.
A modern-day scientist adventurer is about to undertake one of the largest Australian science expeditions to the Antarctic.
Now, that man, the leader of the expedition, was Professor Chris Turney, and his expedition included Greens Senator Janet Rice, who was so excited about seeing how global warming had wrecked Antarctica. I'm off to Antarctica tomorrow, she tweeted. It seems appropriate that my last post here before I go is about campaigning for effective action on climate change. Turns out she probably wanted more warmth in the end, because Rice, Turney and their ship of warmers hit such thick ice that an icebreaker couldn't free them, and they too had to be rescued by helicopters.
The first of the helicopters to take us home! Thanks, everyone!
Look, I could give you other examples. How about 2 years ago, British adventurer Pen Haddo, he announced his own expedition to prove that this global warming was melting away the whole North Pole, and the media left, of course, ate it up.
Haddo attempts to become the first man to travel to the North Pole by boat. The rising temperatures at the polar ice caps has made the impossible possible.
Well, actually, the impossible was still impossible. But unfortunately, few media then reported that his yacht actually got stuck in sea ice when still 1,000 kilometres from the North Pole and had to turn back. Like I said, not much publicity. Scares sell and failures to back them up do not. For instance, the ABC 11 years ago screened a very scary documentary to huge applause, claiming that the Arctic would very soon be melted clean away.
Within a few decades, the vast sea ice that spreads over the North Pole could disappear for weeks or even months in the Arctic summer.
We could have an ice-free Arctic by the year 2070, by the year 2080. In the last few years, those predictions have come way, way in towards the present. And now we're saying maybe 2030, maybe 2020. There's a group that makes a very strong case that in 2012 or 13 we'll have an ice-free Arctic, as soon as that.
But the ABC won't say sorry for that scaremongering, because that melting away of the North Pole in 2013, even earlier, that never happened. The data shows that, yes, there was some melting. We're still retreating from the Little Ice Age, of course. But we've never had less than 4 million square kilometres of ice in recent times. And the South Pole, well, ice there is close to the long-term average. Now, I'm not saying there hasn't been some global warming, but it's been very small, much less than predicted, about 0.13 of a degree each decade. How much of that is natural, we can't be sure. And whether it's actually bad to have a bit of warming, that's highly debatable. I mean, food crops, for instance. They've never been as big as we've seen over the past few years, but most people don't know that. They hear of the scares and the scary expeditions, and they aren't told when the good news comes, or the scary expeditions flop. And that's the context. That's the context that we should remember when we hear global warming scaremongers now treat the fires in Queensland as proof of global warming. And at your bottom dollar there's going to be more politicking about that. Climate emergency and all that kind of stuff. Our politicians are just hopeless on that front. When in fact, as you probably know, the biggest recorded fire in Australian history is still the one in 1851, 5 million hectares in Victoria. Second biggest, 35 years ago now, 3.5 million hectares in New South Wales. How often must it be said? We're talking about global warming, not the weather in Queensland or indeed the ice north of Norway.